The Crash and the Desert Mystery. The night was quiet, with only the sound of the desert wind sweeping across the Mojave. Jake, a trucker who spent most of his nights hauling cargo, parked his rig near a familiar rest stop. He stretched, stepping out to enjoy the cool breeze under the endless stars. It was a peaceful night, or so it seemed. Suddenly, the sky exploded with light. A fiery streak tore through the heavens, leaving a glowing trail behind. It wasn't just any shooting star. It was too big, too bright, and moving far too fast. Jake froze, shielding his eyes as the streak grew larger, heading straight for the desert. A deafening crash followed moments later, shaking the ground under his boots. The horizon glowed faintly with an eerie green light. Curiosity got the better of him. Jake hopped back into his truck and turned toward the source of the light. He wasn't the type to ignore something like this. It could have been a plane crash or something dangerous. He told himself he was just checking if someone needed help, but deep down, he knew there was something strange about what he'd just seen. The dirt road to the crash site was bumpy and dark, but the green glow grew brighter as he got closer. Jake parked the truck a safe distance away, grabbed his flashlight, and walked the rest of the way. His boots crunched against the gravel, and his heart pounded harder with every step. When he reached the site, what he saw left him speechless. In the middle of the desert lay a massive crater, glowing faintly with a greenish hue. Steam rose from the edges, and strange crystals, pulsing with light, were scattered around the impact site. But that wasn't what caught Jake's attention. At the center of the crater, lying motionless, was a woman. She wasn't just any woman. Her beauty was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Her skin shimmered faintly under the moonlight, almost like it was reflecting starlight. Long, silver hair flowed around her shoulders, and her delicate features looked almost otherworldly. Her body was covered in a strange translucent fabric that seemed to have burned away in the crash, leaving her vulnerable in the desert night. Jake hesitated. "Ma'am, are you okay?" He called out, his voice trembling slightly. She didn't respond. He slid down the edge of the crater, careful not to touch the glowing crystals, and knelt beside her. Up close, he could see faint patterns on her skin, like glowing tattoos, fading in and out of sight. Her chest rose and fell weakly, and her eyes fluttered open. They were unlike anything Jake had ever seen, bright, glowing, and full of fear. "Hey, it's okay," Jake said softly, unsure if she could even understand him. "I'm here to help." The woman's lips moved, but the words that came out weren't in any language Jake recognized. Her voice was melodic, almost hypnotic, but the tone was clear. She was scared and desperate. She reached out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. Her touch was warm, almost too warm, as if her body wasn't meant for this environment. Jake glanced around nervously. The crystals surrounding them began to pulse faster, casting long, eerie shadows across the crater. The air felt heavy, almost charged with electricity. Something about this whole scene was wrong. He needed to get her out of here, fast. "I don't know what's going on," he muttered, "but you can't stay here." Carefully, he draped his jacket over her shoulders, trying to shield her from the cold desert wind. She clung to it, her glowing eyes watching him closely. Jake slid an arm under her, lifting her gently. She was lighter than he expected, almost as if gravity didn't affect her the same way it did him. As he carried her out of the crater, a low, distant howl echoed through the desert. Jake stopped in his tracks, his skin crawling. It wasn't the howl of any animal he knew. It was deep, guttural, and alien. The woman's grip on his arm tightened, and she whispered something in her strange language again. Jake didn't need a translator to understand. Whatever had made that sound was coming for her. Pushing down his fear, Jake quickened his pace, heading back toward his truck. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, as if the desert itself was alive and watching. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward them, and every sound made him flinch. When they finally reached the truck, Jake carefully set her down in the passenger seat. Her glowing eyes darted around nervously, and she kept whispering words he couldn't understand. Jake climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and turned the truck around, heading back toward the highway. As they drove away, Jake glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought he saw figures standing at the edge of the crater, silhouetted against the glowing green light. They were tall, menacing, and clearly not human. "Who are they?" Jake muttered under his breath. "And what the hell have I gotten myself into?" The woman didn't answer. She simply stared out the window, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Whatever had brought her here, Jake knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. A princess in hiding. The truck rumbled down the dark highway, its headlights cutting through the inky blackness of the Mojave Desert. Jake kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting nervously on his lap. His mind raced as he glanced at the strange woman seated beside him. Her shimmering silver hair caught the dim glow of the truck's interior lights, and her glowing eyes darted around like a cornered animal. She pulled Jake's oversized jacket tighter around herself, as though it could shield her from the unknown threats chasing her. Jake broke the silence. "Okay, look, I don't know where you came from, or what those things back there were, but you're safe with me for now." He cast a quick glance her way. "Can you understand me?" The woman turned to him, her glowing eyes meeting his. For a moment, she just stared, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Jake breathed a sigh of relief. "All right, that's something." As they sped down the highway, Jake noticed her looking intently at the dashboard, the steering wheel, and even his hands as he gripped it. She seemed fascinated, like someone seeing this kind of technology for the first time. But then she winced, clutching her side, and Jake saw a faint trail of glowing blue liquid seeping through the fabric of his jacket. "Hey, you're hurt," he exclaimed, pulling over to the side of the road. The truck came to a stop with a hiss of air brakes. Jake scrambled to her side, gently pulling the jacket aside to inspect the wound. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The deep gash ran along her side, glowing faintly as if her very blood was alive. The edges of the wound didn't look like a cut. They looked scorched, as though she'd been hit by a laser or some kind of energy weapon. The woman murmured something in her melodic, alien language, her voice weak. Jake shook his head. "I don't understand you, but don't worry, I'll figure something out." From the glove compartment, he grabbed a first aid kit. As he reached for a bandage, the woman placed a glowing hand on his wrist. Jake froze as her skin pulsed with warmth, and a strange energy coursed through him. She closed her eyes, concentrating, and when she spoke again, her words were halting but understandable. "Run, far. They come." Jake's jaw dropped. "You can speak English now." "Learn from you," she said, her voice still shaky. "Words in your mind." Jake wasn't sure whether to be amazed or terrified. He shook his head, trying to focus. "We're not running. You're hurt, and I'm not leaving you behind." The woman's glowing eyes softened, and she gave a faint smile. "You, brave, like my people." Jake cleaned the wound as best as he could, wrapping it with gauze. As he worked, she began to explain in broken English. Her name was Lyra, and she wasn't just an alien, she was royalty. She had fled her homeworld, a peaceful planet called Seraphis, after a hostile faction known as the Syndicate overthrew her family and enslaved her people. The Syndicate's leader, a cruel warlord named Salos, had demanded she marry him to solidify his rule. When she refused, she became a fugitive, hunted across the galaxy. "They track me," Lyra whispered. "Through this." She held up her wrist, where a small, embedded crystal glowed faintly. "Cannot remove. If I stay, they find." Jake stared at the crystal, his mind racing. "So they're using that to find you. And those things back there, they're Syndicate." Lyra nodded. "Hunters, always close." Jake leaned back, his head spinning. This wasn't just some random alien crash landing. This was a galactic manhunt, and he'd just thrown himself into the middle of it. "Okay," he said finally, "then we have to get you somewhere safe. Somewhere they can't find you." Lyra looked at him with a mixture of hope and doubt. Safe? Where? Jake thought for a moment. The desert wasn't safe, not with those hunters prowling around. And the nearest town would only put more people at risk. Then he remembered an old friend. "I know someone who might be able to help," he said. "She's smart, knows about technology and stuff. If anyone can figure out how to get that thing off your wrist, it's her." Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "Trust you." Jake started the truck again, his grip on the wheel tightening. He didn't know what he was getting into, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Lyra fall into the hands of those monsters. As they drove, Lyra leaned back against the seat, her glowing eyes fluttering closed. For the first time since he found her, she looked almost at peace. But Jake's mind was anything but peaceful. His instincts told him they weren't out of danger yet. He kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures from the crater following them. The night stretched on, quiet and tense, until Jake finally muttered under his breath, "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" Unbeknownst to them, high above the Earth's atmosphere, a sleek, black Syndicate warship hovered in orbit. Inside, a tall, armored figure stood before a glowing console. His crimson eyes narrowed as he studied a blinking dot on the screen, the tracker's signal. "Found you," the warlord Salos growled. "No more running, princess." The chase was far from over. The hunters arrive. The sun rose over the desert, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Jake's truck roared down the empty highway, kicking up dust as it sped toward the outskirts of a small town. Lyra sat quietly in the passenger seat, her glowing eyes scanning the horizon. The warmth of the sun seemed to energize her slightly, but the strain on her face was evident. Jake glanced at her. "We'll stop here for supplies. My friend lives a couple of hours away, but we'll need food, water, and maybe some better clothes for you." Lyra nodded, her understanding of English improving by the minute. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice still carrying a melodic, otherworldly quality. The truck pulled into a dusty gas station on the edge of the town. It was the kind of place Jake was used to. Quiet, with a single attendant sitting behind the counter and barely a soul in sight. He turned to Lyra. "Stay here. I'll grab what we need and be back in a few minutes." Lyra's eyes widened, and she shook her head. "No, not alone." Jake hesitated. He wanted her to stay hidden, but her fear was palpable. Sighing, he nodded. "All right. Just stay close and keep the jacket on." They stepped out of the truck, Lyra pulling the oversized jacket tightly around her. Her shimmering silver hair was tucked inside, but the faint glow of her skin was still noticeable in the bright sunlight. Jake hoped no one would pay too much attention. As they entered the gas station, the attendant looked up from his newspaper. "Morning," he said casually, giving them a quick glance. His eyes lingered on Lyra for a moment, but Jake quickly stepped in front of her, blocking the view. "Morning," Jake replied, grabbing a basket and heading for the shelves. He picked out some food, bottled water, and a first aid kit. Lyra stayed close, her movements cautious and curious. She picked up a pack of gum, examining it like it was some kind of alien artifact. Jake chuckled softly. "You'll like that. Sweet. Humans are big on sugar." Lyra gave a faint smile, but her expression quickly changed. Her body stiffened, and her glowing eyes darted toward the window. Jake followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Outside, a sleek black vehicle had pulled up, a strange hybrid of a military truck and something far more advanced. Its surface seemed to shimmer, bending light like a mirage. 3 tall figures stepped out, their silhouettes sharp and intimidating. They wore dark, armored suits that gleamed under the sun, and their faces were hidden behind featureless helmets. Each carried a weapon that looked like a cross between a rifle and a staff, emitting a faint hum of energy. "Hunters," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. Jake didn't need an explanation. The air around them seemed to thicken, and every instinct screamed at him to run. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low but firm. The hunters moved with precision, scanning the area. One of them raised a device, and a faint beeping sound filled the air. It grew louder as the device pointed toward the gas station. "They know," Lyra said, gripping Jake's arm. "They feel my presence." Jake cursed under his breath. "We've got to get out of here." The attendant, oblivious to the danger, stepped outside to greet the newcomers. "Something I can help you folks why?" A flash of light cut him off mid-sentence. The man crumpled to the ground, motionless, as the lead hunter lowered his weapon. Jake's blood ran cold. "They're not here to talk," he muttered. He grabbed Lyra's hand. "Come on." They darted toward the back of the store, pushing through a door that led to a storage room. Jake spotted an emergency exit and kicked it open, the metal door slamming against the wall. The two of them bolted out into the alley, the sound of the hunter's footsteps growing louder behind them. "Split up," Lyra said suddenly, her voice urgent. "They chase me." "No way," Jake shot back. "We're sticking together." A blast of energy exploded behind them, sending debris flying. Jake shielded Lyra with his body as they stumbled into the open. The truck was still parked out front, but the hunters were too close. "Over there." Jake pointed to an old service garage across the street. They sprinted toward it, dodging another energy blast that scorched the ground inches from their feet. Inside the garage, Jake slammed the door shut and looked around for anything useful. His eyes landed on an old workbench cluttered with tools. "Find something to block the door," he said, grabbing a crowbar. Lyra, though weak, helped him shove a heavy toolbox against the door. The hunters' muffled voices echoed outside, speaking in a harsh, guttural language. Jake gripped the crowbar tightly, his knuckles white. "We can't stay here," Lyra said, her voice shaky. "They not stop." Jake nodded, his mind racing. He spotted a ventilation shaft above them, just big enough to crawl through. "That's our way out," he said. "Can you climb?" Lyra hesitated but nodded. Jake helped her up first, then followed, pulling the grate back into place just as the door burst open. The hunters stormed in, their weapons raised, but the room was empty. Above, Jake and Lyra crawled through the narrow duct, every movement slow and deliberate. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept moving. When they finally emerged onto the roof, Jake spotted his truck still parked below. "Stay low," he whispered. Together, they climbed down the side of the building and made a dash for the truck. Jake started the engine just as the hunters appeared in the doorway, their weapons aimed. "Hold on," Jake shouted, slamming his foot on the gas. The truck roared to life, speeding down the road as blasts of energy whizzed past. In the rearview mirror, Jake saw the hunters retreat to their vehicle, preparing to give chase. He tightened his grip on the wheel. "This isn't over," he muttered. Lyra, her voice barely audible, whispered, "Thank you." Jake glanced at her, his determination hardening. "We'll get through this, I promise." The truck sped off into the desert. The hunters closed behind. The game of survival had only just begun. A desert escape. The desert stretched out endlessly, its vast expanse a mixture of dry shrubs, rocky hills, and golden sand. The air shimmered with heat, even though the sun was just beginning to rise. Jake's truck roared across the uneven terrain, kicking up a massive cloud of dust in its wake. Lyra sat in the passenger seat, gripping the edge of the dashboard as the vehicle bounced over the rough ground. "They're close," she said, her glowing eyes fixed on the horizon behind them. Her voice, though calm, carried an unmistakable edge of fear. Jake clenched his jaw, glancing in the rearview mirror. A sleek black syndicate vehicle was closing the distance, its otherworldly design making it look more like a predator than a machine. Its surface shimmered like liquid metal, reflecting the environment as it moved, and its low, menacing hum seemed to vibrate through the air. "Hold on," Jake muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. He veered sharply to the left, heading toward a series of jagged rock formations in the distance. If he could get them into the rocks, maybe they could lose their pursuers. Lyra's breathing was shallow, and her glowing skin flickered like a dimming light bulb. "They won't stop," she said weakly. "Syndicate. Relentless." Jake didn't reply. He was too busy navigating the uneven terrain, avoiding deep ruts and sharp rocks that could tear apart the truck's tires. The Syndicate vehicle was faster and far more advanced, but Jake had one advantage. He knew this desert. He'd driven these backroads and trails for years, delivering supplies to remote outposts and towns. As they reached the rocky area, Jake swerved between the formations, using the towering boulders to block the Syndicate's line of sight. "They can't shoot what they can't see," he said, more to himself than to Lyra. The Syndicate vehicle, however, was more agile than he'd anticipated. It weaved through the rocks effortlessly, closing the gap with every passing second. Jake's heart pounded as he glanced at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was dangerously low. "Perfect," he muttered sarcastically. Lyra's hand suddenly shot out, grabbing his arm. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow crevice between two massive rock walls. "Hide." Jake hesitated. "They'll corner us." "No," Lyra said firmly. "Trust." Jake didn't have time to argue. He jerked the wheel, sending the truck skidding into the crevice. The walls were so close that the truck's side mirrors scraped against the rock. He killed the engine and turned to Lyra. "What now?" She reached out with both hands, her eyes glowing brighter than ever. A strange, shimmering field began to form around the truck, bending light and creating the illusion of an empty crevice. Jake stared in awe. What is that?" "Mirage," Lyra said, her voice trained. "My people. Use for survival. But drains me." Jake didn't argue. He climbed out of the truck, peeking around the edge of the crevice. The Syndicate vehicle screeched to a halt just outside, its occupants stepping out. There were 3 of them, tall, armored figures whose helmets gleamed like black mirrors. They moved with the precision of trained soldiers, scanning the area with glowing devices. Jake ducked back into the crevice, his heart pounding. He could hear their muffled voices, speaking in a guttural, alien language. One of them raised a device that emitted a high-pitched whine. It pulsed with energy, sweeping back and forth as they searched for any sign of Lyra. Lyra leaned back in her seat, her breathing shallow. The shimmering mirage began to flicker. Jake's eyes widened. "They'll see us if this thing goes out." "I can't hold much longer," she whispered. Jake's mind raced. He needed to create a distraction, something to draw the Syndicate away from the crevice. His eyes landed on the truck's fuel canister in the backseat. An idea formed, reckless but their best shot. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the canister and slipping out of the crevice. Lyra reached for him, but she was too weak to protest. Jake crouched low, moving behind the rocks as quietly as he could. The Syndicate hunters were focused on their scanning devices, but they hadn't spread out yet. Jake poured a trail of gasoline on the ground, leading away from the crevice. Then, using a lighter he always kept in his pocket, he set the trail ablaze. The fire roared to life, the heat and light drawing the hunters' attention instantly. One of them barked an order, and 2 broke off to investigate the flames. The 3rd stayed behind, still scanning. Jake gritted his teeth. "One down," he muttered. He grabbed a large rock and hurled it at the base of another boulder, creating a loud, echoing noise. The remaining hunter turned sharply, raising his weapon and moving toward the sound. Jake hurried back to the crevice, sliding inside just as Lyra's mirage collapsed completely. "Time to go," he whispered urgently. Lyra nodded weakly, and Jake helped her into the truck. The engine roared to life, and they shot out of the crevice, kicking up a cloud of dust. The Syndicate hunters turned, realizing too late that their quarry was escaping. The chase resumed, but Jake had bought them precious seconds. He pushed the truck to its limits, heading toward a distant canyon that he knew had a hidden trail leading to an abandoned mine. If they could reach it, they might just survive the day. Lyra leaned her head against the window, her glowing eyes half closed. "You, brave," she whispered. Jake didn't feel brave. He felt terrified, but he wasn't about to give up. "We're not out of this yet," he said, determination hardening his voice. "But we're going to make it. I promise." In the distance, the canyon loomed like a beacon of hope. Behind them, the syndicate hunters regrouped, their sleek vehicle roaring back to life. The escape was far from over. Human resolve. The abandoned military bunker sat hidden in a desolate canyon, surrounded by jagged cliffs and thick, sun-baked brush. Jake's truck rumbled to a stop in front of the rusted entrance, the metal doors half buried in sand and gravel. The bunker had been decommissioned decades ago, but to Jake, it felt like the safest place left in the world right now. He glanced over at Lyra, slumped in the passenger seat. Her once vivid glow had dimmed to a faint shimmer, and her breathing was shallow. The escape had taken its toll on her, and it was clear she wouldn't last much longer without help. Jake clenched his jaw and stepped out of the truck, slamming the door shut. "Stay with me, Lyra," he said firmly, rounding the truck to help her out. She leaned heavily on him, her silver hair spilling over his shoulder as he guided her toward the bunker. The heavy steel doors groaned as Jake shoved them open, revealing a dark, dusty interior. He flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the stale air. The bunker was mostly empty, old crates, broken equipment, and faded maps covered in cobwebs. But it was secure. For now, that was all that mattered. "You're safe here," Jake said, helping Lyra to a makeshift cot he'd fashioned from an old tarp and some crates. She lay down, her glowing eyes scanning the room weakly. "I'll get you water," he added, grabbing a bottle from the truck. Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "Jake, they come." He paused, turning back to her. "Not yet. We've got time." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The syndicate was relentless, and it wouldn't be long before they tracked them here. Jake's mind raced as he paced the room, trying to figure out their next move. They couldn't keep running forever, not with Lyra in this condition. They needed a plan, and fast. An hour later, the sound of tires crunching on gravel snapped Jake out of his thoughts. He grabbed the crowbar he'd been using as a makeshift weapon and crept to the entrance. A small beat-up Jeep was parked outside, and a familiar figure stepped out. "Sarah," Jake called cautiously. The woman turned, lowering her sunglasses to reveal sharp green eyes and a face weathered by years of experience. Sarah was an old friend, a retired military scientist who had seen more than her fair share of strange things. She raised a hand in greeting, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Long time no see, Jake. You look like you've been through hell," she said, stepping inside. Jake let out a shaky laugh. "You have no idea." He gestured toward Lyra, who was lying motionless on the cot. "I need your help, Sarah. She's not from around here." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in Lyra's appearance. "No kidding," she muttered, dropping her bag and kneeling beside the alien princess. "What happened to her?" "She's been running from something called the Syndicate," Jake explained, his voice low and tense. "They're after her for some reason. She has this thing in her arm. It's how they're tracking her." Sarah frowned, gently examining the glowing crystal embedded in Lyra's wrist. "This is advanced tech, way beyond anything we've got. Removing it could kill her." "Then what do we do?" Jake asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Sarah stood, running a hand through her hair. "We have to disable the tracker without removing it. I can rig up an EMP burst, but it's going to take time. And we'll need a diversion to keep those syndicate hunters off our backs." Jake nodded grimly. "Whatever it takes." As night fell, the bunker became a hive of activity. Sarah worked tirelessly, cobbling together an EMP device from the scraps of old military equipment left behind in the bunker. Jake set traps around the perimeter. Tripwires, improvised explosives, anything that might slow the syndicate down. Lyra, though weak, insisted on helping. She explained how the syndicate's weapons worked, guiding Sarah on how to calibrate the EMP to disrupt their technology. Her determination inspired Jake, even as he worried about her health. "They will come in force," Lyra said quietly, her voice steadied despite her exhaustion. "Be ready." Jake nodded, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "We will be." The first sign of the syndicate's arrival was the low hum of their vehicle engines. Jake stood at the entrance, peering into the darkness. The syndicate hunters had brought reinforcements. 2 more sleek black vehicles rolled into view, their surfaces reflecting the moonlight like liquid mirrors. "They're here," Jake said, stepping back inside. Sarah flipped a switch on the EMP device, the faint hum of its capacitor filling the room. "This baby's almost ready. Just hold them off for a few more minutes." Jake nodded, his heart pounding. He grabbed a flare gun and a makeshift Molotov cocktail, heading back to the entrance. "Come on, you bastards," he muttered under his breath. The syndicate hunters emerged from their vehicles, their weapons at the ready. They moved with military precision, spreading out to surround the bunker. Jake waited until they were close enough, then fired the flare gun. The bright red light arced through the air, briefly blinding the hunters and throwing them into disarray. "Now," Jake shouted, hurling the Molotov. The bottle shattered against one of the vehicles, engulfing it in flames. The hunters turned their weapons on him, but he ducked behind a rock as energy blasts scorched the ground around him. Inside the bunker, Sarah worked frantically to finalize the EMP. "Almost there," she called out. Lyra, despite her weakened state, sat up on the cot. Her glowing eyes locked on Jake as he fought to keep the syndicate at bay. She closed her eyes, summoning the last of her strength. A faint shimmer surrounded her, and the air around the bunker seemed to ripple. "What's she doing?" Sarah asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Buying us time," Lyra whispered. The shimmering field expanded outward, disorienting the syndicate hunters and throwing their aim off. Jake used the distraction to retreat inside, slamming the door shut behind him. "EMP is ready," Sarah shouted. Jake turned to Lyra. "Are you sure about this?" She nodded, her glowing eyes filled with determination. "Do it." Sarah activated the EMP, and a blinding pulse of energy erupted from the device, knocking out every piece of electronics in the area, including the syndicate's trackers. The hunters outside staggered, their suits sparking as their systems failed. Jake leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "Did it work?" Sarah nodded, a small smile on her face. "They can't track her anymore." Lyra smiled faintly, her glow returning ever so slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. But Jake knew this was just the beginning. The syndicate might have lost their tracker, but they wouldn't stop. He looked at Lyra and Sarah, determination hardening his features. "We're not done yet," he said. "Not by a long shot." Showdown at dawn. The desert was eerily silent as dawn crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. The syndicate forces had regrouped during the night, setting up a perimeter around the abandoned bunker. Jake, Lyra, and Sarah were trapped, their every move watched by heavily armed alien hunters. Inside the bunker, tension crackled like the static hum of the makeshift EMP device. Jake leaned against the wall, gripping a shotgun he'd found among the military remnants. His knuckles were white, his jaw set in grim determination. Across the room, Lyra sat on the cot, her glow dim but steady. She had regained some strength thanks to Sarah's field medical skills, but the exhaustion in her eyes was evident. Sarah paced near the control panel of the EMP device, her sharp eyes scanning the readouts. "They're not backing off," she muttered. "They're waiting for something, or someone." Jake glanced at Lyra, his stomach tightening. Their leader? Lyra nodded slowly. Xalos. Warlord. Cruel. He will come. Jake cursed under his breath. Then we need to end this before he gets here. Outside, the Syndicate forces prepared for their final assault. Drones hovered silently in the air, their sleek black bodies blending into the early morning shadows. The hunters moved with mechanical precision, their weapons glowing faintly with stored energy. At the center of their formation stood a massive figure, taller and more imposing than the others. His armor was darker than the void of space, etched with crimson lines that pulsed like veins. His helmet, unlike the others, revealed a cruel, angular face with glowing red eyes. Xalos had arrived. Princess Lyra. Xalos called out, his voice amplified by some unseen device. It rumbled through the canyon like a thunderstorm. You cannot hide forever. Surrender now, and I may consider sparing your human allies. Jake stepped toward the bunker's entrance, gripping his shotgun tightly. Sparing us. You fried a guy back at the gas station for saying hello. Xalos chuckled, a deep, guttural sound. Ah, the human. Brave, but foolish. You do not understand what you're protecting. I know exactly what I'm protecting. Jake shot back. And you're not taking her. Xalos tilted his head, intrigued. Interesting. Very well. Let us see how long your resolve lasts. With a wave of his hand, the Syndicate forces advanced. Drones zipped through the air, firing precise energy blasts that struck the bunker's exterior. The ground shook as heavily armored hunters moved forward, their weapons unleashing a barrage of glowing projectiles. Inside the bunker, Sarah adjusted the EMP device, her fingers flying over the controls. The EMP will disrupt their drones and suits, but it'll take a minute to recharge. We need to buy time. Jake nodded. Got it. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Lyra stood, her movements slow but purposeful. No, we fight together. Jake shook his head. You're not strong enough. I am, Lyra insisted, her glowing eyes meeting his. This is my fight too. Jake hesitated, then sighed. Fine, but stay close. The three of them moved to the entrance, where Jake had set up a crude barricade of crates and metal scraps. The first wave of Syndicate hunters approached, their energy weapons lighting up the dark canyon. Jake fired the shotgun, the sound echoing like thunder as the lead hunter's shield shattered. Lyra extended her hand, summoning a shimmering wave of energy that deflected an incoming blast. Beside them, Sarah threw an improvised explosive, sending a group of drones spiraling into the ground. The fight was chaotic. Syndicate hunters moved like shadows, their advanced armor absorbing most of the human weapon's impact. But Jake and Sarah were resourceful, using the terrain and their knowledge of the bunker to stay one step ahead. Lyra's alien abilities, though weakened, gave them an edge, creating moments of confusion and distraction among the Syndicate ranks. As the sun rose higher, Xalos himself entered the fray. He strode toward the bunker, his massive frame exuding power and menace. With a single motion, he raised his hand, and a bolt of crimson energy shot out, obliterating the barricade. Jake was thrown backward, landing hard on the ground. He groaned, trying to push himself up, but Xalos was already towering over him. You fight well, human, Xalos said, his voice laced with mockery. But you are outmatched. Jake glared up at him. You talk too much. Before Xalos could respond, Lyra stepped forward. Her glow intensified, her silver hair shimmering like molten light. Xalos, she called, her voice steady and commanding. You seek to break me, but you will fail. Xalos turned to her, his red eyes narrowing. Bold words for a fugitive. Lyra raised both hands, summoning a massive wave of energy. It collided with Xalos, forcing him back a few steps, but he held his ground, his armor absorbing most of the impact. You've grown weak, princess, he sneered. Jake scrambled to his feet, grabbing an explosive Sarah had left nearby. Hey, Xalos, he shouted, When the warlord turned, Jake hurled the explosive directly at his chest. The device detonated, engulfing Xalos in fire and smoke. For a moment, it seemed like the fight was over, but as the smoke cleared, Xalos emerged, his armor scorched but intact. "You will pay for that," he growled. Suddenly, the EMP device hummed to life inside the bunker. Sarah's voice crackled over Jake's earpiece. "It's ready. Get clear." Jake grabbed Lyra's hand. "Time to go." The two of them sprinted toward the bunker as Sarah activated the EMP. A massive pulse of energy erupted, spreading across the canyon. Drones fell from the sky. Syndicate hunters collapsed as their suits short-circuited, and Xalos staggered, his armor sparking and failing. Jake didn't look back as they dove into the bunker, the EMP's shockwave slamming the doors shut behind them. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Jake let out a shaky laugh. "Did we just win?" Lyra nodded, her glow returning to its full brilliance. For now. But even as they caught their breath, Jake knew the fight wasn't over. Xalos was still out there, and the Syndicate would return. But for the first time, they had hope, and a fighting chance. Humanity's spirit prevails. The desert lay quiet once more, but the silence was uneasy, like the calm before a storm. Inside the bunker, Jake leaned against the wall, catching his breath. His shirt was torn, his face smudged with dirt and sweat, but his grip on the shotgun was as firm as ever. Beside him, Lyra's glow had returned to full strength, a stark contrast to her earlier weakened state. She stood tall, her silver hair flowing like liquid light, her gaze steady and determined. Sarah was at the EMP console, her fingers flying over the controls. That blast bought us time, but it didn't take Xalos out completely. His armor is damaged, and his forces are scattered, but he's not going to give up. Jake frowned, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek. "So, what's the plan?" "We can't just keep running." Lyra stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "We don't run. We end this." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that, Princess?" Lyra turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with an otherworldly determination. "Xalos's strength lies in his armor and his connection to his forces. If we sever that connection, he will be vulnerable." Sarah nodded, catching on. "You mean his suit's command system? It's likely tied to the Syndicate network. If we can disable it, he'll lose control over his remaining forces. And how do we pull that off?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the wreckage of the drones and the still smoking remains of their barricade. "We've got a bunch of scrap and an old EMP device. That's it." Lyra held up her wrist, where the now inert tracking crystal gleamed faintly. "This still holds power. It can disrupt his connection, if we get close enough." Jake's stomach twisted at the thought. "Close enough? You mean within arm's reach?" Lyra nodded. "It is the only way." "No," Jake said firmly. "That's suicide." Lyra stepped closer, her glowing hand resting on his arm. "It's my fight, Jake. My people depend on me. I won't let him enslave another world." Jake stared at her, his chest tight. "You're not doing this alone." Sarah cleared her throat. "Hate to break up the moment, but we need to move. If Xalos is regrouping, he won't wait long." Jake nodded reluctantly. "All right, let's finish this." Outside, the Syndicate's forces were in disarray. Drones lay scattered like broken toys, and hunters stumbled through the desert, their suits sparking and malfunctioning. But Xalos was still standing. His armor, though damaged, pulsed with energy, and his red eyes burned with rage. The warlord stood atop a rock formation, his voice booming across the canyon. "Princess Lyra, show yourself. Your resistance is futile." Jake, Lyra, and Sarah emerged from the bunker, stepping into the harsh sunlight. Jake carried his shotgun. Sarah had an improvised energy disruptor slung over her shoulder, and Lyra walked ahead of them, her glow intensifying with every step. Xalos's eyes narrowed as he spotted them. "So, The human insects fight beside you. How quaint. Lyra stopped a few paces from him, her voice ringing clear and strong. Your reign ends here, Xalos. You will never enslave another soul. Xalos laughed, a deep, menacing sound. And you think you can stop me? You are alone. She's not alone, Jake said, stepping forward. She's got us. Xalos tilted his head. Brave words. Let's see if you can back them up. With emotion, Xalos raised his gauntlet, sending a shockwave of crimson energy toward them. Lyra countered with a shimmering shield of light, deflecting the attack. Jake fired his shotgun, aiming for the exposed joints in Xalos's armor, while Sarah activated the disruptor, sending a pulse of blue energy that caused Xalos to stagger. Lyra pressed forward, her glowing hands weaving patterns of light that struck Xalos's armor like hammer blows. Each strike weakened the warlord, but his resilience was staggering. You think this will be enough? Xalos growled, his voice filled with fury. He lunged at Lyra, his gauntlet glowing with deadly energy. Jake stepped in, swinging a crowbar with all his strength. The impact cracked the warlord's helmet, exposing part of his face. Xalos roared, swatting Jake aside like a ragdoll. Jake! Lyra cried, her voice breaking. Jake groaned, pushing himself up. I'm fine. Just finish this. Lyra turned back to Xalos, her eyes blazing. She raised her wrist, the crystal embedded in her skin glowing brighter than ever. This ends now, she said, her voice echoing with power. She thrust her hand forward, and the crystal unleashed a burst of pure energy, striking Xalos directly in the chest. His armor crackled and failed, the crimson lines dimming as his connection to the syndicate network was severed. Xalos fell to his knees, his red eyes flickering. You cannot win, he rasped. Lyra stepped closer, her glowing form towering over him. It's over, Xalos. With one final pulse of energy, she shattered his gauntlet, rendering him powerless. The remaining syndicate hunters, sensing their leader's defeat, retreated into the desert, their vehicles disappearing over the horizon. As the sun rose higher, Jake, Lyra, and Sarah stood over the defeated warlord. The desert wind carried away the last echoes of the battle, leaving only silence. It's done, Sarah said, lowering her disruptor. Jake looked at Lyra. What happens now? Lyra's glow softened, and she smiled faintly. Now, we rebuild. My people will rise again. And I have you to thank. Jake smirked, his exhaustion giving way to relief. Anytime, princess. As they walked back to the bunker, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They had faced impossible odds and won, not just because of Lyra's power, but because of their courage, their determination, and their refusal to give up. The syndicate might return one day, but so would they. Together, they were unstoppable.